Hi guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Scooty Space podcast. What we are discussing today is all about the human impact of financial crime. So what does that mean? Well, everybody sees financial crime as it's loss of money, it's loss of revenue, and on the surface you might perceive it as like, oh yeah, it's just companies that are just like getting hit and losing money. But that's not necessarily the case. Individual lives often get affected, whether that's personal savings, whether it's mental health, whether it is the ability to trust. It goes a lot deeper than that surface level of, oh, I've been scammed. There's so much more to it, and that's what we'll be discussing today. It's all about the human impact of financial crime. My guest today is Murray Barbour, the director of financial crime at Monzo. But who better to give a little bit of an introduction to himself than Murray himself? So yeah, Murray, if you could let the audience know a little bit about your background, and then we'll get into the topic, if that's all right.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Nick. So I'm Murray. Like I said, I've worked in financial crime for the last 20 years or so, with kind of a little break in between, but on the most part across financial crime and fraud. I started in fraud operations, taking calls from customers, speaking to customers about issues they might have on their account relating to fraud, and worked my way up kind of from there. So I've seen all different aspects of fraud and financial crime over my time. So I started in Royal Bank of Scotland Group, like I say, talking to customers, and then eventually working up to become an ops manager, looking after the 24/7 team, protecting customers from fraud across the globe. And then from there, went to Black Circles, which was a bit of a divergence, from what I was doing, and looked after the customer contact centre at Black Circles across the UK and India. And for those that don't know, Black Circles is an online tyre company, and through that time we kind of revolutionised the tech that we were using and how we set the contact centre up. After that, back into fraud and financial crime. I was head of fraud operations at JP Morgan for the Chase UK brand, the digital-only bank that's been launched in the UK and shortly to come in Germany. Again, grew the team there from about 150 to kind of 450.
Chase, literally when I got off the train today.
Yeah, they're everywhere now. The TFL when you're tapping to come out and on the ticket machines, and so very interesting, kind of brand new bank, but within a larger corporate. So lots of opportunity to do different things.
Yep.
And then about a year and a half ago now, Monzo came and asked if I'd like to move across to work with them. So yeah, as you say, Director of Financial Crime Operations now.
Brill. So we're absolutely in safe hands today in terms of an SME in this area, of all about sort of, like you say, the human impact of financial crime. So there's no easy way to segue into this. More often than not, I like to do a helicopter overview and start it soft and then get more and more sort of impactful as we go on. But I think due to the severity of what we're talking about today, there's no easy way to butter this up. So talk to me about, obviously, firstly, how do people get scammed then? I know that's quite a subjective, vague, ambiguous question.
Yeah.
But just talk to me about what a scam is and how it actually happens.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many ways in which people can get scammed, and some of them are less sophisticated, some of them are extremely sophisticated. And, we talk a lot about scams and the impact it has on people. And, there is really no shame now in becoming a victim of a scam, because it is so easy to do, and these people are so intelligent, so smart, and so detailed in what it is that they do. But scams can range from anything from fairly simple phishing attacks where you get an email or a text and with a link to click. You click on that link, you may be asked to provide information relating to card details. Quite common ones are, we've got a parcel for you, you need to click this link and provide payment details because there's postage missing, and it's not the parcel courier at all. And sometimes you might not be expecting a parcel, but if they send that out to hundreds of thousands of people, a small percentage of them will be expecting a parcel and may think it's legitimate. So when it comes to phishing, it is en masse. It's a numbers game to try and get those people that are in the situation that makes sense to the email that they've received. I think banks and other financial institutions have done a lot to try and protect against phishing attacks these days, introducing other authentication methods when you're making payments and things like that, introducing better interventions, so therefore it becomes harder and harder. On the other side of it, you've got very complex scams that can last months, even years, in terms of the way in which the scammers get their victims bought into what it is going on. And these tend to look like romance scams or investment scams, where customers are taken in by the bad actor. It might be multiple bad actors that they're conversing with, and they either believe that they're truly in a relationship with that person who desperately needs their help, and who wouldn't help somebody that they're in a relationship with, and if they need it, or investment, where they're tempted by large returns on their money, and it's then just one more payment and then we can get your funds released. Or there's been a problem, we just need one more payment before we can get your funds released. And they, at that point, they're then too far in to back out, and they kind of believe that continuing with it is the best option, because in their head they've still got that belief that the money will come and that it'll all be okay. And like I say, it's so easy, there is no shame in unfortunately falling victim to these sort of things. They are very deceptive, very good at what they do, and it is how they spend their livelihood, unfortunately.
Of course, yeah. And it really is getting more sophisticated, isn't it? And like you say, yes, we can have a little bit of a laugh and a joke of previous years when you mentioned phishing there quite recently. And God, there'd be some horrific attempts a few years ago. It's like just spelling errors, or it's like fonts all over the place, graphics all over the place, or the email domain is just not even close to. It jumps out thinking, God, this is just obviously fake. But now I don't know whether it's because of, well, I do know it's like with the advancements of AI and just with the development of organisations that we will get into later on in the podcast. That it's just becoming a lot more sophisticated. And I'll tell you a story, Murray, about even myself. It was about a year ago now. Now, bearing in mind, I work in cybersecurity, so I'm every single day, it's some part of my day is thinking about cyber. So therefore, it's ingrained in my brain. It's almost autopilot now. But the one time I sat on, I'd finished work, sat down on the couch with my missus and my boy at the time. And I say at the time because I've now got a little girl as well. The boy, my little boy's still there. And essentially, I got an email, tax return. I think it was like 85 quid or something like that. I thought, okay, I'll have a look at it, as you would. I thought, I was like, okay, well, it looked like it actually had like the email was like, it had like a HMRC domain. So I was like, okay, tick. I moved on from that, clicked on it. It took me through to like a HMRC government looking website. I was like, okay, cool, this is looking fine. I'm clicking through it, but still there was like the brake pads were going on in my head, like, because like even if it was like, because it was 80 quid, it was quite a modest amount as well. It's not like 500 quid where I'm like, give me the money. It was 80 quid. It was a modest amount where I'm like, won't mind 80 quid.
Yeah, of course.
So I was like, carried on going through, and I thought, oh, okay, like I'm still a little bit suspicious about this. It doesn't look exactly right, but very good. And to the point where I was like, I was suss it out, and I was looking on the HMRC, and I was like scrolling down, and I tried to click on contact us or try to get back to the main menu, something that isn't an obvious click, where they wouldn't expect to do it, and it wouldn't go on it, and I was like, that's really odd. I can't get back to the main menu or something like that. So obviously it's a very, I don't know if it's screenshot it, but even the pixelations looked fine as well. It was sophisticated, and because it wouldn't take me back to that main page, I was like, that's not real, that. But that's because I work in cyber, and I appreciate that, like, that's dodgy. It might have been legit to this day. I don't think it was, but it was sophisticated, and I was like, God, I almost got caught there. So it's just testament to the fact of anybody could get scammed these days, and it's not true.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on the advancement of AI, and we're all using in the banking industry, the financial industry, and wider, we're all using AI and large language models and these sort of things to try and detect financial crime, to try and detect fraud, and therefore protect our customers, protect society from the impacts of it. But so are the fraudsters, and so are the scammers, and the, all these kind of large scale organisations that are out there looking to deceive people. And I've not tried it, but I reckon I could probably go and ask ChatGPT to create an HMRC page that has this functionality and make it look as real as possible, and it could probably give it a good try nowadays, and give us something to work with. So to your point, like, AI is a great tool in the fight against financial crime and fraud, but it's also one of the worst enemies in regards to financial crime and fraud, and what it can do to support the bad actors and what it is that they want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to bring you to your day to day then. Obviously, when you are, you're fighting fraud on the front line. Then, how do you even go about sort of like setting up processes? Because you must have people ringing daily
Hmm.
with their case studies, and it must be so many different sort of attack vectors that they're coming in at, and like it must
Yeah.
be so many different use cases, or is it not? Is there eventually there's like general patterns? It's this organization that we're aware of.
Hmm.
Okay, it's this and that. Or how do you sort of qualify, categorize all the different types of fraud? And another point to that is, how do you constantly be empathetic with those individuals where you're like, okay, this has happened,
Hmm.
we'll try and help it, but you might not be able to get back this person's life savings.
Yeah.
How do you go about your day to day, essentially, Murray?
Yeah, so I think there's two elements there in terms of how do we detect this stuff and how do we try and protect against it. So like I say, we use LLMs and these sort of things
Yep.
and large models to try and work out exactly what's going on, and the benefit of using them is as the attack vectors evolve, as can they, and they can support us in finding that. A big element still comes down to the human beings, though, and that's our teams on the front line. That's our investigators that are speaking to customers, or investigators that are analysing accounts, looking for money muling activity, or whatever it may be, to then identify that we think we might have a criminal organisation that are using the same MO,
Yep.
and then our analysts can go and look at that and try to bring in protections against it.
Yep.
Ultimately they will evolve, and therefore we need to kind of evolve with them and try to stay one step ahead and think, okay, how do we make this as broad as possible when it comes to putting in a prevention rule, model, whatever it might be that we go down to try and do that. It's not easy. It takes a lot of people, a lot of dedicated people. I'm really lucky to work with a lot of talented people, both in my team and around me, whose goal it is every single day is to get up out of bed and come and try and do a bit of good in the world by finding these things and protecting against them.
Yep.
The other element is also understanding what's normal activity for your customer, and when that activity starts to diverge a little bit or looks a bit different, we can then intervene and potentially have that conversation. But then you've got to try and persuade them that what you're telling them is the truth, and that this might be a scam, because they might have been speaking to this person for 18 months and you've just gotten in front of them to talk to them about it being a scam, and you've got to build that trust very, very quickly
Yes.
to try and overcome it. And then from an empathy point of view, at the end of the day, it's a human being. It's somebody that is potentially going through one of the worst moments of their life. They are the victim of a criminal act. They are the victim of what can be a very intrusive criminal act if they know a lot of it about you and things like that. Any criminal activity is obviously horrible, but if you've been speaking to somebody for 18 months, shared your deepest, darkest secrets with them, and it turns out that it's something, that's been set up to take advantage of you and to try and deceive you, then psychologically and the impacts of that are just devastating.
Yeah.
So our team do an amazing job speaking to customers every day on the fraud side, detecting crime every day on the financial crime side, and working together to try and do everything that we can to stop it. But the reality is we won't stop everything, and we can't stop everything. And then we need to be there to help the customer pick up the pieces from that in terms of what's happened to them.
How do you leave work at the door in terms of where does your responsibility start and end? Because yes, you can to the full of your extent help with the financial side of it in terms of the utilizing the LLMs and the fighting fraud activities. But there's more to it. There's the psychological element, as you touched on throughout, and you're not trained therapists.
Yeah.
You're not counsellors, and you can't dedicate all your time to help this person rebuild their trust and rebuild their confidence. Where does it start and where does it end in terms of that support on the psychological side, Murray?
Yeah, absolutely. And talking broadly across the industry, there's a lot of focus, rightly so, on vulnerable customers. And there's two elements of vulnerability. There's customers who are vulnerable through, potentially something ongoing in their life. They've suffered a bereavement, they've got long-term illness, whatever it may be, and we've got a duty to protect them. But there's also situational vulnerability.
Yep.
And I would argue that the vast majority of people that are victims of a scam fall into that category. Now, some of them can deal with it because they've got a support network around them. They're easily able to move past it, put it behind them, and take it as a learning experience. But understandably, a lot of customers aren't, and all the banks have kind of teams of specialist people that are there to support customers in vulnerable situations and signpost the right support. We're not therapists, and you know, it would be wrong of us to try and solve that problem for the customer, because it might not be the right resolution for them. But what we can do is signpost them to charities and other organisations out there that can hopefully help them with the mental side effects. You know, there's a couple of kind of smaller charities starting up in this space who are now more dedicated to supporting customers who have been through these sort of situations, which I think is badly needed. You know, the charities out there do a great job, but having something dedicated more and more towards customers who are victims of scams is a huge start.
Yeah. And do you ever have instances where people are ringing up saying that they've been a victim of fraud, and in fact they have not been, which in essence is fraud? Do you ever get that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a whole other side to the industry where we've got to look at these reports coming through and understand the validity of them, and we've got to work with other banks to do that right across the industry. You know, across the industry, that is a kind of key focus, is trying to detect these sort of first-party frauds attacks. And sometimes these can be groups of people who are all, you know, passing funds between themselves, all claiming to be victims, when in actual fact they're all working together. You know, recent changes to rules that allowed better protection for customers that have been the victim to APP scams has been great, and absolutely is the right thing to do. But we also know that there will be fraudulent groups out there trying to take advantage of that and use it in their favour to get more money out of the bank if they can as well. So absolutely, and it's the element that we also need to be on the lookout for, is that first party element right across everything that we do.
You've mentioned throughout this podcast so far, Murray, that the scale of fraudulent activity, and you've often alluded to groups, organisations. It's not just this hooded person behind the computer. It's not necessarily that. This is an actual organised crime network, very, very popular one. Now, talk to me about the scale. Like, it does actually work like businesses, don't they? I think there is actually sort of buildings and office spaces designed to commit fraudulent activities. So tell me a little bit about these organisations.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, there's a scale. You know, you do have lone actors that are out there doing different things that benefit them directly or whatever it would be. But more and more, a lot of this is either linked to organised crime or is an organised crime or an organised criminal group in itself. You know, organised criminal organisations, they need to get funding from places, and sometimes they will do that through scams and fraud, and it will be an offshoot of another activity such as drug trafficking, people trafficking, arms trafficking, whatever the kind of core, I guess, function of that criminal organisation is. But more and more, there are now organised crime groups that are focused purely on scamming customers and making as much money as they can from that. We know that around the world, in certain regions in particular, there are scam compounds that are massive compounds of office blocks where people are essentially trafficked into these areas. So they are lured in by fake job adverts, etc. When they arrive in the country, their documents are taken off of them. They're taken to these compounds. They're essentially imprisoned within these compounds and forced to sit on the phone or sit on email or websites scamming customers. And they are set up in some of cases like any organisation would be, where you've got leadership, you've got targets, you've got KPIs, you've got different roles. You know, you have the people that are phoning and trying to get the hook in, and then you've got the closer, the person that's the real expert, the psychological expert that then can close the deal and get the customer bought in. So it's not unusual in some of these scenarios for the customer to speak to a couple of different people. The first person they speak to is the person that's phoning en masse, trying to get the person to take it on. And then you speak to the kind of real expert in this place. And, you know, if you look at any normal organisation, it wouldn't look much different, where you've got your kind of frontline team supporting customers or doing the kind of core activity. And then you've got your kind of group of escalations that they go into where it's really serious, really complex, or it needs some specialist skill. So it is scary. It's done en masse. And there's an element of sometimes the people that are in these compounds, or a huge element of these people in these compounds, are victims themselves. They are being imprisoned under threat of violence, under threats to their family, or whatever it may be, to basically do what it is that these organisations want them to do.
Yeah, it alludes to sort of the evolution that we mentioned at the start, obviously on the technology standpoint with AI. But what you're saying there in terms of the evolution for scamming and fraud, for it to survive and for it to, because obviously it's a massively profitable is the wrong word, but there's a lot of money in fraud, isn't there? A hell of a lot. So
100%.
essentially, it's like they need to evolve to survive as a criminal organisation. So they need to mimic the real life as much as possible.
Yeah.
But it was a really interesting point that you made there in terms of some of the fraudsters are actually victims themselves, like you
Yep.
say, from the human trafficking. And it was case in point. I did a podcast with a gentleman called Jack Nightingale, who is an Austin analyst for Flashpoint.
Yep.
And he's actually brought out his own book, all focusing on deconstructing the human smuggling ecosystem.
Yeah.
And he mentioned that people get lured to the land of the UK where they're promised their hopes and dreams, and it's not that, and they can actually be coerced into sort of like you say, work like this. So like, do you ever get people committing the fraud, kind of reaching out and say like, look, I'm in this bit of a precarious position. I've committed this criminal activity, but it's through no fault of my own. Do you ever get that? And do you ever utilize them as like internal ways of battling fraud? Like, okay, we'll help you, but we need more information. Kind of like an insider agent. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I would say we get people telling us that they have, or sharing scenarios, and we can then understand that they've potentially also been the victim. So there may be money moving through their account, and we then say, do that investigation, and they share that they've been tempted by an online job ad, and this was kind of the job that they were asked to do, and things like that. And you've then got to balance up the different elements across, and this is right across the industry, and every bank will see this, which is who's the true victim, who's the true perpetrator, and how do we treat that? And every bank will treat that slightly differently because we all have different risk profiles and different ways that we want to do that. I wouldn't say we then use them as like insider kind of agents as such, but we try and learn as much from those scenarios as we possibly can, to help improve how we detect fraud in the future, and how the industry kind of looks at that. And I think the thing with fraud and financial crime is there's a lot of conversation at different forums, whether that be industry forums, whether it be government forums and things like that, where we have the ability to talk about what trends we're seeing across the industry, and how we can best work together to try and stop them. Because firstly, we've got an obligation to the companies that we work with to protect them from financial crime, and do what we can to stop criminals using them. But one of the reasons I do this job is that kind of much wider social obligation, which is, if we move it from bank A to bank B, we've not really solved a problem, we've just moved the problem. So collectively, can we work closer together to try and solve the problem once and for all? And we probably never will, but as best as we possibly can to try and stop it altogether. It's, there's an element of, yes, you work for a business, and there's appropriateness as to what we can talk about.
Yes.
But fraud and financial crime has very clear forums in which we can have those conversations to allow us to try and stop the criminal activity right across the board.
Yeah, really interesting point. And sorry if it feels like I'm bouncing back a little bit, but I'm just really curious of just going back to sort of the individual victims of fraud. And when it comes to them losing life savings or them losing a lot of money, do you even financially help them at any point? Because this person might have lost all the money and might not be able to make ends meet by the end of the month. Yep. And whilst it's not necessarily Monzo's fault, for example, if it was just because they bank with you, you know what I mean, you're just facilitating it at the end of the day in terms of like where they keep their money. How do you actually help them? Does it have to be like a credible ongoing investigation? Because I'm sure that the rent landlords, like, there's like, well, we need our money at the end of the month. Like, it's not we didn't get scammed. But you're still under our roof. So how would you actually facilitate help on the day to day with these people?
Yeah, again, there's very clear guidelines across the industry on how we need to help customers that are in these situations. The first is the much more strict timelines now around reimbursement for customers that have fallen victim. So when the rules changed a year ago in October now, so October 2024, it brought in much stricter timelines, and the time that we've got to evaluate cases, the time that we have to refund cases and make decisions on them. And I think there's then two outcomes. Customer gets a refund. Financially, they're fine, but socially, psychologically, how do we support them? And that's one element. And then you've got customers who might not get a refund. Now, that doesn't mean to say that your obligation to that customer stops there. You've still got to do what you can to help them. And that's where our specialist teams of kind of vulnerable customer support would come in, because at that point they are situationally vulnerable. Again, even more so than being the victim of a scam, but they now potentially are in a financial vulnerability situation, and we need to help them with that. So again, we have specialist teams across the industry, and we would signpost to charities that might be able to support our other locations as well. It all really depends on individual customer circumstances and what's going on. We obviously always want to do everything we can to protect customers that are in these situations.
Yeah.
And that's both from pointing them somewhere that can help them from a psychological effects perspective, but as well from a monetary perspective and what that might mean. I think the good news is that with the change in the rules, more and more customers are getting reimbursed because, yes, in a lot of these scenarios, they will have made the payments, but these are very, very sophisticated scams that, as an industry, we need to recognise are not easy to detect. And I think we've done that with the new rules, which is a real positive for customers and the protection that they now get against these sort of things.
Yeah. You mentioned there a couple of times about the new rules that came in October 2024. Whilst that sounds amazing for the victims for the of fraud, oh great, it's fast timelines. How do you cope with the resource and the additional time pressure to resolve cases then on your team? Then how do you do that?
Yeah, essentially we had to, and we had to get to a position that we were able to support at the levels of time that the regulator expects of us, and it's the right thing to do for customers and right across the industry. And we speak to lots of different partners, companies, other banks, and we look at how we're using technology to support with these sort of things, and how we can make decisions quicker using the technology that's out there, using AI and all these sort of things. So an element is the people side of it and needing more investigators, and that's a associated cost of how we do business. The other side is how do we leverage technology to help take the strain off of that so that we can make these decisions quickly, accurately, and to the standard that's expected of us.
Yeah. No, it makes complete sense. It's really, really interesting. And I sort of only got one last question around sort of the human element, and it is that sense around the is the aftercare. I know it gets moved over to the vulnerability customer team, but it's not like even victims that they might have got done 12 months ago. It takes a long time to rebuild the trust in that. So again, where does the book lie in terms of like, when do you pass over this care for them? Because that can live with you for a long time. It's intrusive, is being the victim of fraud.
Absolutely.
The wool has been pulled over your eyes a little bit, and like you say, as we've mentioned throughout, sophistication is getting more and more. With the sophistication could come the cost. I know we mentioned off camera that I was speaking to a previous guest, and their family member, they were basically their family member was like really coerced into this very quite sophisticated, very what you were saying there about the authority that this person came across. Like for a couple of months they were speaking to them, the credibility got across. They were quite sort of very professional with the way that they did it. It didn't sound like a typical sort of fraudster, if that makes sense. And then eventually it was like, it was what you were saying there about we just need more money to release it. And it was in crypto, so it was a few years ago, so it was a bit of an unknown. And eventually it was like, I've been scammed. And it's like they ended up going into a bit of a depressive episode, and as such, it was a case of like, my family member has been hurt. Fraud, it looks real on the surface, but I don't know anyone who's been fraud. But then when someone it can actually be hard to bring them back round for it. So I'm just curious as to where Monzo's sort of responsibility ends when it's like, okay, we've solved your case, we've passed you over to this team now. Is it 12 months? Is it done by timeline? Is it done by case? Where does the book lie, Murray?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it is difficult because there's such wide range of effects. We've talked psychological effects, but there's the element of trust as well. Like we hear of victims that no longer want to pick up the phone because they got scammed by somebody who phoned them out of the blue, and all of these sort of things, and it is really difficult as a bank to be able to try and address every single element of that, because like you said, we've got expertise, we've got different areas that we can help with, but there is some areas that we can't. I think for me it is then about what the banks can do is make sure they know the right people and the right experts to help direct that customer to, bring in partnerships with some of these companies potentially that we can refer them into, and we can share information between with the customer's permission and all that sort of stuff, which right now in the industry doesn't overly exist, but I think is a direction that we'll probably end up going in some respects.
Yeah.
To make sure, because for me, it's about making sure that person gets to the right person that can help them. And I don't know if a bank is best placed to help them with all of those
Yeah.
effects. I think, sometimes you could potentially make that situation worse rather than better if you're not the expert and you don't have the experience and the expertise to help them understand it. So I think as an industry, we need to move in a direction that looks more at the aftercare. I think we've done a lot looking at trying to prevent these sort of things. We've done a lot looking at how we solve these sort of things when they do happen.
Yeah.
I think the aftercare element is still relatively untouched across the industry, and is something
Yeah.
that we need to think about a bit more still. And I personally have spoke to a couple of kind of different people that work for charities or helplines in this space that, if as an industry we kind of move in that direction, I think could make a real difference for customers, because, it can last for 12 months, it can last for longer, it can be live with you forever. I don't think on the most part you would ever forget about it, but how do you help that customer build up that element of trust and belief again, but to a reasonable point? Because the other element that we've not overly touched on is, once you become a victim, once you become a target for future.
Oh,
And
okay.
we know of instances of groups and criminal organisations selling this information between themselves as another monetary kind of gain of customers that have fallen victim, and therefore could be vulnerable again in the future. So
Yeah.
it's about making sure that we give them the right education and aftercare. And I think technology can help us with that as well. How do we, in all the banks nowadays have apps, how do we kind of push learning material and things to their app if they have been the victim, to help them understand how it might have happened, how they maybe protect themselves again in the future, without also making that too scary?
Yes.
Because there's the other side of it, which is, if if they've already got a hit in terms of the amount of trust that they now have because of what's happened to them, there's a risk that you kind of push too much, and potentially make it even scarier for them, and you
Yes.
make that a worse situation. So there's a real balance to help support the customer without then going too far to the point that they think, well, I'd never want to open the door now because I could be scammed at any turn.
Yeah.
And I think we need to kind of nail that in the industry, because I think we've got examples of where it's done well and done to a reasonable standard, but I think as a industry there's elements that we can do better there.
There's been a subliminal theme run throughout this pod, Murray, about the use of technology and how both sides have actually been using it. You obviously mentioned between AI and LLMs, but to put you on the spot, is obviously throughout the past 2 decades that you've been in fin crime, is your job easier or harder than, say, 10 years ago? Because it changed a lot. So, I know there's not a right answer. I'm just curious as to your thoughts with technology. Which side has benefited more?
Yeah. I think it's harder partly because of technology, but in a couple of different ways. So when I first started out in fraud and financial crime, one of the first jobs that I had was, we reviewed IP access to customers' online banking, and we identified unusual IP addresses that didn't match the country that we would expect. And we phone that customer and have a conversation, and that's how we would identify that they'd potentially had their online banking hacked. And this is back in the day where you logged in using a customer number and a password or a PIN, and didn't have any sort of secondary authentication devices or push notifications to verify that it's you, so before secure customer authentication. That was relatively simple because it was done in IP addresses, VPNs weren't a big thing, and all these sort of things, so it was quite easy to detect a lot of this unusual stuff that was happening. I would say nowadays the banks have done a lot in the technology sphere to improve authentication of customers, to improve login experiences, to make them smooth and frictionless as much as possible for the customer, but really difficult to get round for the fraudster. What that means is the fraudster's now gone after the human being that is in the middle of that, which is the customer. And that is so much harder because every human being is significantly different in how they work, how they operate, what they think is normal, what they don't think is normal, what their banking account activity looks like, and everything like that. And I would say that a while back, and like I say, when I first started, it wasn't there was a one size fits all, but there was very clear kind of MOs that we were able to kind of track, not easily, but relatively easily, in terms of what was happening. I think nowadays, because they target the human, the MOs are so wide ranging and so different that it becomes much harder to track. And I think technology that the fraudsters have access to helps with that. We look at deep fakes and all these sort of things. But even like you touched on earlier, if you go back years ago, the grammar and phishing emails and stuff was sometimes quite a tell. Nowadays, with AI, you can produce these sort of phishing emails perfectly with very little effort. And it becomes much more believable and much more. So there is an element of the technology the fraudsters have access to, but I would say that the biggest element of technology is that the banks have got relatively good on the technology side at trying to intervene and stop some of this kind of bad actor activity. That, like say, they now go after the human being which is the customer, and that is much more difficult to try and track because of the significant differences.
Yeah, no, really well answered. And just got time for one last quick fire question, Murray, and it's a little bit of a softer way to end the pod on what was a very, very important subject. And it is basically your financial crime five-a-side team. And what I mean by that is it's just a chance for you to shout out five members that you previously worked with, where you like, they were a superstar when I came across them. And if I had to start a company tomorrow with five other fighters, who would you take along with you, Murray?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've picked people from my past because the people that I work with today, I've got the joy of working with them every single day, and they're already part of my team. So if I was considering people that I wanted to bring to work alongside me or work with again, I think the first person would be my first kind of senior boss in this space, Stephen, who done a lot for me in my career and gave me my first kind of steps into this sort of leadership role within fraud and financial crime. And, I think without his support, guidance and mentorship through those kind of first 4 or 5 years under working with him, I don't think I'd probably be where I am today. So I don't think I could say not to have Stephen in there because I think I owe him so much, but also his knowledge, the way he approached things, he was it could be really tough in terms of his standards and what he expected. They were very, very high, but always with the right intentions and always with the right outcome in mind. And that's what I really valued from working with him. I think the second person would be Joe P, who I worked with at Chase, the MLRO there. Just such a down-to-earth person. She really understands the space. She's very pragmatic. From a second line perspective, it was great to have that relationship with somebody from that space, working in the first line and, being able to use them as a sounding board and collaboratively work together on problems and make a difference, which was really great. I think the next person would probably be Graham Barrow, who hosts the Dark Money Files alongside Ray Blake. But Graham and Ray, both of them, and you could interchange that name probably, do a lot in this space around businesses and trying to detect fraudulently registered businesses. They've got a company that supports that element, but I've came across them a couple of times at different conferences and had the joy of listening to them speak and talk about what it is that they do and the work that they do in that space. And I just think their knowledge is just unbelievable, and really, every single time I've came across them and listened to them, I've just really, really enjoyed it. My colleague from Chase, Corinne, who looked after financial crime ops, I looked after fraud ops. Again, just her knowledge in that space. She's experienced working in the US, working in the UK. Anything that's worth knowing about financial crime, Corinne would know, was all over everything, and was a huge support as well. We worked really closely together and supported each other massively, working together in Chase, which was, just really enjoyable.
Yep.
And then the final person would be JJ. So again, someone I worked with at Chase, looked after the fraud side more primarily, but again, just a really valued partner, looked after fraud product. Just a great character to work alongside. His knowledge, his experience. He's worked in kind of Barclays and places like this before, but I came across him at Chase. Again, just really supportive, really valuable. Always interested in working collaboratively to solve problems. How do we balance this with operations? How do we make sure we get the right outcome for customers? How do we get the right outcome for your team and for the bank overall? And just his knowledge, his experience, his approach, just something that somebody I loved working alongside and would love the opportunity to do so again.
Fantastic. Perfect. And that pretty much brings us to the end of the podcast today. So, like I say, it's a very, very serious topic that we discussed today. It is the human impact of financial crime. So if anybody has any questions or would like any more information from Murray, I'll be sure to put his information down below. But once again, Murray, thanks so much for coming on the Security Space podcast.
Thanks for having me, Nick. It's been great.